Start with a news spotlight, mission spotlight with Jean Sequeira. We are very fortunate to have Pastor Sequeira with us for this week, and his wife also accompany him this time. And we are going to hear from her this mission spotlight. So I'd like to invite her to come here.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be with you here this evening. I remember being here once before and taking a photograph of Dr. Merritt and his wife and two little girls and how they've grown. So that must have been a few years ago that I was here. This church reminds me something of the church that we had in Washington, D.C. with 700 members and 45 nationalities. It was a taste of heaven. And I think that's what you feel in this congregation too. I was planning to share with you each evening some stories about people that we have met around the world. Since Jack and I retired, I don't think the Lord got the email telling him that, because we still keep getting messages from people inviting us to different places, and if we have nothing to do at that point of time, we will accept an engagement anywhere where he sends us. Pastor Jack just returned from Uganda, and we're happy to be here. You may hear from my accent that I'm actually from London. When I was 17 years old, I was cycling home from work and saw an advertisement for some meetings in Edmonton, North London. And I started going to the meetings. Pastor Ken Gammon, I don't know if any of you remember him, but he was the preacher there at those meetings. I walked in and he was preaching about Daniel chapter 2 and this statue, and I had never heard such a thing in my life, and I just sat there mesmerized, and I would go evening after evening until my life was totally changed. And I became baptized and a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I thank God for that. I remember when I was baptized, going down into the water, and Pastor Gammon said, "The Lord has some wonderful things in store for you." And I didn't know what he meant, but the older you get, the farther back you can remember. And yes, we have had some wonderful things happen in our life. And so I would like to share some of those with you. I was planning really to talk about other people, but somebody asked if I would mention just a few experiences of ours when we were in Uganda. Jack was called to be principal of our university, or college as it was, at Bugema in those days, near Kampala. You could not be president of a company or of a college because only Idi Amin was allowed to have that title. He had, I think, 22 other titles as well, but my husband was principal of our college. And while we were there, we enjoyed working with the people. They're wonderful Christians. We had some amazing experiences with the people there. But sadly, when Idi Amin came on the scene, things began to really go bad for the people. And one time he announced that he'd had a dream. And that dream was sent by God. And it's always dangerous when leaders of countries feel that God is speaking through them, because how can you go against what they say? And he said that he believed that all of the people of Indian origin should leave the country. Many of those people were third-generation Ugandans. Their grandfathers had come to build the railway line from Mombasa up to Uganda. What do you do? How can you deport your own citizens? We just were amazed that this could even be thought of. But the world stood by and let it happen. And we were so amazed that these things could actually happen. Where do you go when you're a citizen of of one country and they send you away? We saw people crying because their papers were torn up at the embassy. They were refused permission to come to England. Many of them went to Canada. They dispersed all over the world. And it was a time of difficulty for many people. 80,000 people being pulled away from one country at a time. And those people had a love for Uganda just like we did. During the 3 months that we were given notice that we had to leave, many things happened in our experience, but we were not really expecting these things to happen. But as I look back and see, we're just totally amazed at what God can do. And sometimes I think it's very true. You receive not because you ask not. Our faith is sometimes too small. We don't ask God for the big things. And at this time, when we were to be sent away from this country that we loved, from the people who we cared for, many strange things were happening. One of them was that our bank accounts were frozen. We were not allowed to take local money out of the country. And one day, a man came to the door of the house where we were living. And he looked very well dressed, a nice gentleman. And I greeted him. And he said, "I am the father of one of your students at Bugema. And I've come for your car." I didn't quite know how to take that. Had he come to take our car or had he come to buy our car? He didn't say. And so I waited for him to explain. He said, "I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Uganda Electric Company at Jinja on the River Nile, and I've been given permission to buy a car, and I want yours." Now, you have no idea what this meant to us, because people were driving to Entebbe Airport and leaving their vehicles there because they couldn't take the money out of the country. Why should they sell them? And I thought, well, why doesn't he go to Entebbe and get one of those? They're just sitting there. And he said, "No, I want your car, because Pastor Jack is a fundi." Now, if anybody knows Swahili, fundi in English roughly would be translated jack of all trades, okay? When our car needed fixing, he would fix it. He would call the students and have them see how it was done, and he would work on our car. You see, in those days, you would never take your car to a garage in Africa, because if you took it there and left it overnight, all of your parts might not be there the next day. So he wanted our car because he knew that Pastor Jack had looked after it. He said, "I'll take your car, I'll go to the police and have them assess it, and I will come back with a quotation, and if you agree, we will pay you for it." And I must have been dumbfounded. I was lost for words, which is very unusual for me. He took the car, he went to the police, he came back, and the quotation he gave us was more than we had paid. And then the thing that really, really surprised us, he said, "How would you like this money? Would you like it in Uganda shillings or American dollars?" What do you think I said? I thought, this is very strange. We are in a country that is deporting us. We are not allowed to take Uganda money out of the country, and God sends this man into our life to buy our car when he could go and get one for free, and God is going to put a check in our pocket written in American dollars by the government that was deporting us. How amazing can that be? We receive not because we ask not. And at that time, I'll tell you, we were really praying. We prayed for God to work in our lives. And that was one of the experiences that we look back on, and we thank him for showing us that he loved us and cared for us.
Thank you, Jean. That's a wonderful way of opening a week of prayer, to talk about how one of the ways the Lord answers prayers. And we're very blessed to have your husband here. Jean, thank you for bringing him along. Jack, come up to the microphone here. Now, it was this time last year. It was about the same time last year, wasn't it, that you were
Yes.
that you were here, and you shared over a weekend some aspects of the gospel, and you very unwisely said, "Well, if you want me, I'll come back for a week and share about the book of Romans." And so we took you up on that threat.
Thank you.
And here you are. It's a blessing to have you back. You're going to be sharing during this week of prayer from tonight, then each night, twice on Sabbath, then each day leading up to Saturday week.
Yes.
You're going to be sharing different aspects of the book of Romans, taking us through the entire letter of Paul to the Romans, aren't you?
That's right.
And in fact, someone coming through tonight said that they've read your book. A couple of people have read your book on this subject, the book of on Romans. So, do you want to just perhaps give us a bit of a roadmap of what might happen over the next week or so?
Well, first of all, Romans is my favorite book because it opened my eyes to the gospel. Now, normally in my 5 churches that I pastored in America, I normally spend 32 Sabbaths preaching on Romans. So you can imagine I'm going to squeeze a lot of stuff in a short while. I hope you don't get spiritual indigestion. But I'll try and make it simple, and I hope that you will receive a real blessing, because this is the book that clearly explains the good news of salvation. That is why Luther referred to it as the clearest gospel of all.
That's Martin Luther, isn't it?
Yeah, Martin
Not Luther,
Luther.
your next door neighbour. Not Luther, your next door neighbour.
No,
it's
no,
Martin
no,
Luther, yes.
not my neighbor.
So, and you've laid out a bit of a challenge for us, and that is that over the next 8 days, that to read the section of Romans
Yes.
that you're going to speak on this session.
Yeah, I hope you all have this piece of paper.
If you don't, there are some available at the door as well, yeah?
Okay.
And tonight you're going to be talking on the first 2.5 chapters of
Yes.
Romans, or 2 2/3.
Yes, you're right. It's a big
And
section.
It's a big section, and it's the universal sin problem.
Yes.
The universal sin problem.
Yes.
Now, if you don't have a Bible with you, Jean over here is going to bring some out. So, hand up, just put your hand up if you would like a Bible, because Jack is going to be going.
You need to have the Bible.
A couple here. Jack, we are really blessed to have you
Thank
here
you.
with us, you and your wife, Jean.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to spending the next week with you. God bless you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, church. And I hope that you'll have this weather. I couldn't believe it to see the sunshine. It's unusual for England. But I'm glad to be here. You know, it took us 2 days to come here. We left on Thursday, arrived at noon today. And I've just returned from Uganda, where it was 11 hours time difference. Here it's 8 hours from where we stay. But I'm absolutely excited to go through this book. In fact, in my churches, when we turn to Romans, I never use that word. I say, please turn to my favorite book, and they all know it's Romans. Now, what is special about Romans? What makes it such a special book? You must keep in mind that when Christ came here 2,000 years ago, he came to be the gospel. But it is Paul who was set aside to explain it. For example, if you read Ephesians 3 verse 8, Paul says that even though I'm the least of the saints, God has given me this grace to preach the unsearchable riches of Christ to the Gentile world. And if you look at the very first verse of chapter 1 of Romans, he says, I'm a slave of Christ, I'm an apostle, but I'm set aside to preach the gospel. Now, what makes Romans special? Okay, from the time Paul was converted on the Damascus Road to the time he was executed as a martyr for Christ was approximately 30 years. During that time, he went all through Asia Minor, establishing churches. But he had one great desire, and that was to go to Rome. And the reason he did not go to Rome is because he was prevented. If you have your Bible, and I'm going to use both Bibles, my New King James and your Bible, the NIV, so that, whichever translation you have, they are both saying the same thing. But if you turn to Romans chapter 1, the very first chapter, and you look at verse 13, you will discover what Paul says there in his introduction. Chapter 1 and verse 13. Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now. Okay, if you go to the NIV, which puts it a little bit clearer English in modern language, he says the same thing, except the word may not be the same, but the thought is the same. Verse 13 of the NIV says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now. He repeats that in chapter 15 and verse 22. Now, why did God prevent Paul to go to Rome, the capital of the world in those days? He had you and me in mind. I don't think Paul imagined that the world would last 2,000 years after he even believed that Christ could have come in his day. So God had you and me in mind, because you see, all the other letters that Paul wrote, it's almost half the New Testament, he's writing to churches that he had already established. But this is one church he had not established. So here he gives the full counsel. What he preached in the other churches, unfortunately they didn't have tape recorders in those days, he wrote it out in the book of Romans. And that's why Martin Luther referred to Romans as the clearest gospel of all. Now, if you look at chapter 1, please notice what he says in his introduction. In verse 14 of chapter 1, he says, I am a debtor both to Greeks, that is the Gentiles, and to barbarians, both to wise and to the unwise. So much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. And in the NIV, he says the same thing, but in a little more clearer words. I am bound both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to wise and foolish. And verse 15, that is why I am eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. And then in verse 16 and 17, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jews and then for the Gentiles. For in it, that is in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to the last, just as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Or as it says in the New King James, that I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greeks. And then he expounds on it, or he defends it, or explains it. And today we are going to look at the universal sin problem, which begins in verse 18 of chapter 1, right up to chapter 20 of after verse 20, chapter 3. Now, why does he spend such a big section of Romans on the sin problem? Well, you see, the gospel is God's solution to the sin problem. And to really appreciate the gospel, to clearly understand the gospel, we need to come to grips with the sin problem. And that, is something that most people, most Christians, have not fully come to grips with. You ask the typical Adventist, what is sin? The typical answer is, sin is the transgression of the law. Well, folks, sin is much more than that. Do you know in the Hebrew Old Testament there are at least 12 different words for sin? And in the Greek New Testament there are at least 5 different words for sin. So sin is a big thing. But Paul sums up the sin problem by one verse, verse 18. The rest of it is exposition of that statement. So let's look at chapter 1, verse 18, a very important verse because that's the statement. So I'm first going to read from the King James, the New King James. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And the NIV puts it this way. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now there are 3 statements, 3 facts that he mentions that we need to come to grips with, which he expounds. The first is the wrath of God. And as we will study today, the wrath of God is God's reaction to the sin problem. Okay. The second is the most important, ungodliness. There Paul is dealing with the very nature, the very core, the very heart of the sin problem. And unrighteousness is the result of ungodliness. So the key word that we need to understand the sin problem is the word ungodliness. To understand that, there are 2 things I need to share with you. The first one is that in the Bible, especially the New Testament, sin is presented as a verb, and the Greek word is hamatano, or as a noun, hamatia. The verb has to deal with actions. It has to deal with behavior. And that is the emphasis of every non-Christian religion, including pseudo-Christianity. We are concentrating on behavior, but behavior is the fruits of ungodliness, which is the noun. And sin as a noun has to do with our nature, with our condition. And unrighteousness is the result of that nature. An orange tree can only produce what? Oranges, because that's the nature of the tree. Okay, now with this in mind, I would like you to look at a text that may help you to understand what ungodliness is. Okay, keep your finger at Romans 1, turn to chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, and look at verse 7. And here Paul defines the true condition of our human nature. Okay, chapter 8 of Romans, verse 7. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. And the NIV puts it this way. The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Now let me explain. The word sinful mind, or as the New King James puts it, carnal mind, the word that Paul uses is sarkitos, from the word sarx. Sarx is flesh. So what Paul is saying, the mind controlled by our sinful nature is enmity with God. And you and I are born with that nature. Did you know that? We are born with a nature that hates God. Now you must make a distinction between nature and the mind. The mind is changeable. That's why the word repentance in the original means a change of mind. But our nature cannot change. And the Bible makes that clear. Can an Ethiopian change their skin? Can a leopard change its spots? Then how we who are by nature sinful produce righteousness? So we must be clear where the core of our problem is. It is not in our behavior. Let me give you an example of two men of the Bible. One who was very good in his behavior. His name was Nicodemus. He was like Paul before conversion. He could say with Paul, regarding the righteousness of the law, I am blameless. If he was living today, he would be called a holy Joe. The other one is Barabbas, a terrible criminal. As far as their behavior is concerned, they are poles apart. One is very good, at least in his own eyes. The other one is full of sinful acts, murder and all kinds of things. But do you know, folks, they both end up in the same place, in the grave. And death is the wages of what? Sin. Why should Nicodemus end up in the same place as Barabbas? Because the problem is not behavior. The problem is their condition, their sin problem. And there is no human solution to the sin problem in terms of nature. Yes, we can change behavior, and that's the emphasis of all religions. That is the emphasis of the independent ministries that have plagued our denomination. Heartland, Firm Foundation, Grossball, Waymark. They concentrate on behavior. In fact, one of them challenged me when I was preaching at the Washington camp meeting. He said to me, I want you to know that I have not sinned for the last 2 years. And I gave him a text which says, he who claims he has no sin is a liar, and the truth doesn't abide in him. Because he did not come to grips with sin as a nature. Yes, it is possible to change people's behavior from bad to good, from sinful acts to self-righteousness. But in God's eyes, both are sinners, 100%. That is why Isaiah 64 verse 6 says that all our righteousness, our behavior is filthy rags in God's eyes. And the best people in terms of behavior in Christ's days were the Pharisees. Now the word Pharisee means separated ones. These were the people who did not mix with the other Jews. They took great pains to follow all the rules of their church and gave great pains to everybody else while they were doing so. But you should read Christ's evaluation of them in Matthew 23, verse 5 onwards. You know what he calls them? Number one, he calls them hypocrites. And number two, he calls them blind guides. That's why they felt insulted. A hypocrite is somebody who pretends to be what he is not. And that's what self-righteousness is. So there is no solution to the nature of sin. The only solution is Jesus Christ. Let me give you what I mean by that. Please turn to John chapter 1. Listen to how John the Baptist introduced Jesus when he began his ministry. John chapter 1, and I'm going to read from the NIV, verse 29. The King James is saying the same thing. John 1:29. Okay, here is what he said. The next day, John, that is John the Baptist, saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away," what does he take away? The sin singular is the noun. The definite article is Christ came primarily to take away the sin problem. Tomorrow morning I will explain how he did it. But that is our nature. And when we allow that nature to control us, we always turn against God. So with this in mind, turn to Romans chapter 1 and see how Paul expounds it. He's made the statement in verse 18 that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against two things: ungodliness, that is the nature of sin, and unrighteousness, which is the fruits of that nature. Okay, now look how he explains it. Verse 19, because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has showed it to them. In other words, God has revealed himself to every human being. How? Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. You know, today modern science has produced some wonderful things and some very bad things too. But science depends on pre-existing matter. God did not. He spoke and it what? Happened. That is why Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 tells us that we believe that God created this world without any pre-existing matter. Because his breath is energy. You know, there are some today, I'm talking of Christians, they call them theistic evolutionists. They believe that it is impossible for God to have created this world just by speaking. Well, my answer to them is this. How do you think, what will happen when Christ comes the second time? And all he'll do is, wake up folks, and even though you have turned to ashes, in a twinkling of an eye, you will resurrect. If you deny creation, then you have to deny resurrection. You know, one day we were taken to a funeral home. Now, by the way, dying in America is very expensive. And they took us to this funeral home, you know, while I was studying at Andrews University. And there was a casket that had a beautiful casket. There was a big sign on top of it which said, when this casket is sealed, nothing can go in and nothing can get out. And I said to the owner of the casket, you haven't understood the gospel. When Christ comes, he will speak, and that casket, if it is a Christian, will shut open. And even though the worms that were sealed in has eaten his body, he will rise up perfectly with a new body. So Paul is saying that if people have turned their backs on God, it is not out of ignorance, it is deliberate. And that's verse 21 repeats that. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but because became futile in their thoughts and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like ours, like corruptible reptile, corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Now, of course, today you say, we don't worship such birds and things. But we do worship. Mankind today is worshipping his own mind. He thinks he's pretty smart. Let me read these words from the NIV. I start with verse 19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles. So that is the very nature that you and I were born with. We are born with a nature that is anti-God. And if we allow our minds to be controlled by our nature, it will end up hating God, turning our backs on God. Because that's the very essence of our nature. And sometimes, because that enmity with God is painful to our conscience, we try to substitute it by human behavior, self-righteousness. And we think, that because we are doing the right things, that we are acceptable by God. No, folks, the only time you're acceptable before God is in Jesus Christ, which is what we'll cover tomorrow. Now comes the question, how does God relate to this human behavior? And verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28, 3 verses, is the best explanation of the Bible in regards to the wrath of God. We must never try to understand the wrath of God by projecting human wrath onto God. Human wrath is somebody who has lost his temper and is lashing out. That is not God. Yes, unfortunately, the devil has painted such a picture of God. But let's look at what the Bible says. Okay, verse 24. Therefore, that is because they did not want to retain God in their thinking. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. And then he explains in some detail. I go to verse 26. Because of this, that's because they don't want to retain God in their thinking, God gave them over to shameful lust. And in verse 28, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. In other words, what is God's wrath? You see, God is a God of love. And when you deliberately turn your back on him, he doesn't force you to accept him. My wife and I had the privilege to work in Ethiopia for 6 years, where we met married, 1 year after we arrived, Haile Selassie was deposed and was replaced by communism. And I heard with my own ears, on the radio, the new communist government announcing, we have no more room for God in scientific socialist Ethiopia. The government of the country had turned its back on God. And they closed all schools from 10th grade to university for 2 solid years. And they put them into camps of 150. It was called the Zamacha. And during those 2 years, they were brainwashed with the communist idea, the Marxist philosophy, which denies the existence of God. And these kids had to raise their left arm and shout 2 slogans. And this is what the slogan said in English. God is an imposter, Christ is a devil. Anyone who disobeyed was either shot or stoned to death. I know married did not obey that requirement. And God preserved his life. He's in, you know him all. Well, I'll tell you, that is the biggest problem with an atheistic government. It tries to solve, and I'm going to quote Karl Marx, the social and economic injustice of the world, of human race. But it did the very opposite. Because, you see, there is no solution to our sinful nature. So when we went to Ethiopia, we went to our college. We had the house they gave us to live in had an orange tree in the backyard. And we looked forward to have oranges from our own tree. And when the first orange got ripe, we cut into 4. And we all took a bite, and it was as sour as anything. And I said, boy, there's a problem here. And my daughter, 3 years old, she's now in Nigeria. You know, she does international public health. She is directing an immunization program in northern Nigeria. But she was 3 years old then. She said, Daddy, I have a solution. And I said, what's that? Feed the tree with sugar. So I went to the market and bought 2 kilos of sugar, sprinkled it around the tree, and some fertilizer. And her brother was 2 years older. His job was to water the tree. Well, I'll tell you what, the next season, the oranges looked much larger, much juicier, and they looked much sweeter than the previous oranges. So when the first one got ripe, I brought it into the house, cut into 4, and I said, who's going to have the first bite? And my daughter said, me. This is my idea. And her brother said, no, I was the one that did most of the work, watering the tree. Do you have such problems? So I had to toss the coin, and my daughter won. She took the orange, the quart of the orange, she put it in her mouth and said, wow, this is absolutely sweet. Was she right or was she wrong? You are not sure. She was teasing her brother. It was just as sour as the first one. So he grabbed the other one and put it in his mouth, and I had to stop the fight. And she turned around to me and said, what went wrong? I said, Jenny, the problem is not what you feed the tree with. Yes, you can make it look better, juicier, sweeter, but the problem is with the nature of the tree. No matter what you do, you cannot change the nature of the what? Tree. And a sour orange tree will always produce what? Sour oranges. So I said, there's only one solution. Dig the tree up, cut it and dig it out, and plant a new one that is sweet. And I had a cousin who was working for the United Nations in Ethiopia, and they were experimenting on a navel orange tree from California. It's a grafted plant that produces sweet oranges without any seeds. It was an experiment by the United Nations. It was not for the public. But since he was my cousin, I said, can you give me one tree? And he did. So we dug out the old one, threw it out, and planted the new one. Unfortunately, we were transferred. But the guy who took over and stayed in that house wrote to us and said, everybody wants, they come for one orange so that they can take the seeds and plant it, but they were shocked, no seeds. They could not understand how an orange tree could produce oranges without seeds. Well, modern technology, can do many things. But they were amazed how sweet it was, how juicy it was, and how it had no seeds. So also, folks, the formula of the gospel is not I, but who? Christ. And the hardest part is the not I. It's the hardest part, because we want to make some contribution towards our salvation. In Africa, pastors have 8, 10, 15 churches. Most of the soul winning is done by the lay people. About 90% is done by the lay people. Because I was the minister secretary of both Ethiopia and of Kenya and Uganda. But one day the lay people went on strike. You know what the argument was? If Philip, a deacon, can baptize, why can't we baptize? Because they were not allowed to baptize. It was only the pastor who did the baptism. They did all the work, and the pastor got all the glory. That's why they like the song, Glory for Me. And I asked them at least one question. Are you fighting for truth, or are you fighting for yourselves? Does it matter? I said, look at the greatest evangelist of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17 and 18. And when Paul says, God did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And here's the greatest evangelist who established so many churches in Asia Minor. So going to chapter 1, Paul is saying that God's wrath is simply this. God says to human beings who want to live without Him, okay, go ahead. And what happens when men live without God? What happens when a nation turns its back on God? Crime increases it. The result of that is unrighteousness. And most people think that the problem is unrighteousness. And they try to solve the problem by adding more stringent laws, increasing the police force. That doesn't help. It only sends the problem underground. These criminals are crafty. You find one way of solving it, they'll find another way to repeat it. Because unrighteousness is only a symptom. You can decrease, I've had malaria 12 times, and you can decrease the fever of malaria by taking an aspirin. But you're not dealing with the cause of the problem, only the symptom. And so extra laws and extra policemen is not dealing with the source of the problem. The source of the problem is ungodliness. And what the world needs to see is, they need to see two things. That number one, they are incapable. They have no solution to the sin singular problem. And number two, God sent His Son primarily to deal with the sin problem. And when He dealt with the sin problem, He dealt with the behavior. Because when you cut the orange tree down, what happens to the oranges? Do they come down also? Yes, but Christ came to deal with the cause of the problem, to take away the sin of the world. And so while we have people of all levels in terms of behavior, we have very good sinners and very bad sinners, and everyone else is in between. In nature, we are all in the same boat. There's no difference. So as Paul, now remember, most of the members were illiterate. They could not read. So normally the messenger who took the letter would stand up and read the letter. Now the church in Rome was made of a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, about half and half. Now these Jews were from Asia Minor. They were expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius, and then under Nero they were allowed to come back. And Paul wrote to them at the time when they were back. And these Jews and these Gentiles would not sit together. You would have one side Gentiles and one side Jews. And as the messenger read chapter 1 of Romans, Paul, a Jew himself, can imagine these Jews nodding their head. Oh yes, we knew all along that these Gentiles are a bunch of sinners. The first time we went to the United States was in 1964. I just graduated from New World College, and I could not go back to Africa because I was born in Kenya when it was a British colony. And then in 62, while I was at New World College, it became free. And the difference was this. Under the British, it was called Kenya. Now it's Kenya. So they told me I was not born in Kenya. I have no right to come back. I was born in Kenya. The only way I could get a work permit was to get a master's, so I had to go to Andrews. Okay? But you see, the thing is this, that when I went back to Kenya, I spoke the same language as they did. I speak Swahili, but and by the way, the word Baraka, he was half a Kenyan, you know that. We might have half a Kenyan as the President of the United States in November. And he came from a part of Kenya that is very, very strong Seventh-day Adventist. See, when the British ruled Kenya, they divided each province to a different denomination. And South Nyanza, which is where his father came from, was given to the Adventist Church. So the college is in that area, Kamagambo. The hospital, Kendo Hospital, is in that area. The printing press, Africa Herald, is in that area, because that was our area. And every Luo, that's the tribe, when asked what religion, they would put SDA, even though they don't go to church. Everybody is an SDA, And the word baraka means blessed in Swahili. So he's hoping to be blessed in November. But I have no confidence in politicians. I still remember when Idi Amin took over in Uganda. Man, there was great rejoicing, drums, people rejoicing even in our church. At last we have got rid of Obote, who was pro-communist. Now we have Idi Amin. And I heard with my own ears what he announced when he took over. He says, I'm not a politician, I'm a military man. I've got rid of our Obote, and I'm going to make sure the country is in good condition for 1 year, and then you can choose your own president. And everybody rejoiced. But not long after that, he did away with the constitution, and he declared himself Idi Amin, the president of Uganda for life. And he had a big sign, Idi Amin, the conqueror of the British Empire. Oh, I tell you. We have a wonderful expression in English. The proof of the pudding is in what? Eating. So I say, let's wait and see. Both guys are giving wonderful promises. No tax for the middleman. Well, I don't know. We'll find out. But folks, these Jews, when they heard the chapter 1, applied it only to the Gentiles. And so when we were going to en route, we went on a ship called the Queen Mary, which is now rotting in California. It's a nice hotel, but the bottom is rotten, so it is no longer seaworthy. And on the ship were 5 rabbis from Jerusalem going to New York for a huge Jewish convention. And it took 5 days to cross the Atlantic. And I said to Jean, I'm going to try and witness the gospel to these rabbis. Friday evening, I saw one of the rabbis walking on the deck, and I went up to him and I said, excuse me, sir, can you tell me when does sunset take place? Because we kept the same day for 2 different reasons, but we kept the same day. And he just looked in front of me, did not respond to me. So I repeated my question. I thought maybe he didn't hear me. And this time I saw real anger in his face. And he just walked away. And there was a sailor scrubbing the deck, and he said to me, you did a terrible thing. I asked him a simple question. What's so terrible about that? And he said, don't you realize you're a Gentile and he's a Jew, and the very fact that you spoke to him, he has just had his bath to get ready for his Sabbath, and the fact that you Gentiles spoke to him, he has to go and have another bath. That's how the Jews in Paul's day looked at Gentiles. So when the Lord brought this basket of unclean animals and said to Peter, kill and eat, he's not referring to eating meat. Those unclean animals is the way the Jews looked at the Gentiles. And God said, what God has cleansed, don't you ever call them unclean. And that was the beginning of the gospel through Peter going to the Gentiles. So Paul can imagine these Jews. So in chapter 2, he turns to his own people. And listen to what he says to them. Therefore, you are inexcusable, O men, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge others, you condemn who? Yourself. For you who judge practice the same thing. Okay, let's look at what the NIV says. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same thing. The only difference is that the Gentiles did it openly, these Jews did it underhanded, in the dark. And he goes and, Paul is a Jew himself. Listen to what he says in verse 17 onwards of chapter 2. Indeed, you are called a Jew and rest on the law and make your boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. That's how they thought of themselves, The NIV puts it this way in verse 17. Now, you, if you call yourself a Jew, If you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior because you are instructor of the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark. So this is how they felt about themselves. But now look at Paul's evaluation of these same people. Verse 21. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? And then in verse 24, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. And then he goes and lashes out at his own people. Okay, verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you not commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you not rob temples? And verse 24, as it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now what was the problem of the Jews? They looked at sin only in terms of behavior. The same mistake that many of us do. And these Pharisees were experts at outward conformity. They did all things so that people would see how good they are. Behavior. You know what Jesus said in Matthew 23? You are like beautiful tombstones. But inside you're full of what? Dead men bones. You're like a cup that is washed outside but inside is filthy. See, they looked at sin only in terms of behavior. Let me give an example. The Pharisee would stand up and say, I have never murdered anybody. And Jesus said, one moment. If you hate somebody in your heart without a cause, you have already what? Murdered that person. Christ is touching at the very core of the sin problem in those statements. If you look at a woman to lust, even though you don't commit the act, you've already committed what? Adultery. And Paul discovered that after his conversion. And when we come to Romans 7, we will look at that. So the Jews made the mistake of defining sin only in terms of behavior. And that, folks, is our problem. We need to look at sin at the very core of the problem. Okay, now he goes on and on. But now let's look at the conclusion. He expounds verse 18 of chapter 1 from verse 19 right up to chapter 3, verse 8. But verse 9 to 20 is the conclusion of what he has been discussing. What then? Verse 9 of chapter 3. What then? Are we better than they? Who's the we and who's the they? Okay, let's see what the NIV has to say. What advantage then? Verse 9. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? And his answer is not at all. We have already made the charge, that is in the previous verses, that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under what? Sin. And that's the noun. Now the word under was a term used in Paul's day. Remember, Paul lived in a slave society. About 40 to 60% of the population of Rome were slaves. And a slave was always under his master. The word under means ruled by, dominated by, controlled by. And Paul is saying it doesn't matter what your behavior is. Whether you're a Pharisee who fasts twice a week and does all the good things, or if you're a criminal, you're both under what? Sin. You're ruled by the sin. And when we come to chapter 7, you'll discover Paul calls sin the law of sin that dwells in my members. And here the word law has the same meaning as the word law of gravity. It's a constant force pulling everything down. And you and I have a force in us pulling us down all the time. And unfortunately, that sin nature is not removed from you at conversion. It will be removed from you at the second coming of Christ, when this corruption puts on what? Incorruption. So you will always be battling with this force that is dwelling in you. And when that force knocks you down, the devil comes to you and says, you are not good enough to be saved. Is he right or is he wrong? No, he's right. None of us are saved because we are good. We are saved by the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And grace is undeserving merit, folks. So what Paul is saying here, that both Jews and Gentiles, it doesn't matter which camp you belong, and that's the whole world, is ruled, dominated slaves to sin. And then he proves his statement, because that's a statement, he proves it in verse 10 to 18 by quoting from the Bible, the Old Testament. We'll read only two statements. Look at verse 10. As it is written, that is in the Old Testament, there is none righteous, no, not one. Have you got it? How many are the righteous? Not one. The last part of verse 12. There is none who does good, no, not even what? One. Now I can imagine you saying, this is impossible. Many people, non-Christians, do good things. The United Nations does good things. But folks, the difference is this. We judge people and ourselves by our behavior. God judges by the what? Heart. I was coming home one day on this not this road, but Edgware Road, many years ago. And at that time, this whole area was occupied by the Jews. This was a Jewish synagogue, remember? And a lady from a second floor called me. Now, I don't remember exactly where on the road, but she called me. It was Friday evening. I was coming from a youth program. And she said, excuse me, sir, can you come and turn my light on? Now, I saw her olive face. The window was quite high. So I thought maybe she's, an invalid or incapable. So I said, sure. I climbed up the steps, went to the door that she gave me the number. And when I arrived there, she opened the door for me. And I said, man, if she opens the door, why can't she turn the switch on? It puzzled me. And she saw the puzzle in my face and she said, I know this is a strange request, but you see, I'm a Jew. It is a sin for us to turn the light on because it's kindling the fire. Now, she didn't know who I was, and I'm a bit of a rascal. I said to her, but sister, doesn't the law say that even the stranger within your gates should not be working? And she was shocked that this Gentile knew the fourth commandment. And she said, yes, but she said, you're a Gentile. You're lost in any case. It doesn't matter if you break the Sabbath. Now, she had on her table a Hebrew Bible. I said, please, can you read me a text from your Bible? She said, sure. I gave her, 1 Samuel 16:7. You know what it says in the original? God looks at the what? Man looks at the outward appearance or behavior. And she read it and she said, what has this to do with my request? I said, sister, everything. So I went and I switched the light on. I said, here's the problem. As far as you are concerned, this Gentile turned the light on, kindled the fire, and broke the Sabbath. But sister, I was not doing my will. I was doing your will. So as far as God is concerned, you turned the light on using me as a tool. So you have also, in God's eyes, broken the Sabbath. And she was very unhappy. She said, you're making it very difficult for me. And I said, no, not difficult. Impossible. I learned that from a Jew who said, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. Romans 1 verse 20. And she said, are you trying to make me a Gentile? I said, no, you don't have to become a Gentile. What I'm saying is, please accept Jesus, who was a Jew himself, as your Messiah. That's your only hope. So please remember, Paul is quoting all these texts from the Old Testament to prove that the Bible teaches that sin is more than behavior. Sin is what we are by nature. So I don't care how good you are in your behavior, your nature doesn't change one iota, even after probation closes. And this is the big mistake of these independent ministries. They are trying to get you to change your behavior that you will be ready to face the time of trouble. No, folks, you will always be a sinner till Christ comes. When this corruption puts on one, and when we come to chapter 5, I will show it to you more clearly. Okay, but now look at verse 19 and 20 of Romans chapter 3, the conclusion. Now we know, and I hope by now you know, that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. You see, God placed the human race under the law. That's why he gave it through Moses. Not to solve the sin problem, but to expose it. Because sin is also a deceiver. It convinces you you're not that bad. You know, when I was young and foolish, I used to race motorcycles. I had the fastest motorcycle in Kenya. It was a British Vincent Black Shadow. I could do 140 miles per hour with 3 guys on it. That's how fast it was. So when I went back as a missionary, and all these pastors had large number of churches, and public transportation was very difficult, very unreliable, they saved money to buy a motorcycle. So one day one pastor calls me. He said, can you please come and help me? I've got enough money to buy a motorcycle. So we went to a second-hand motorcycle place called Swan Singh. I tried many of them, and there was a good 350 Honda. And we bargained with the owner of the shop, and he finally agreed to a price that the pastor could pay. He paid the money, got all the documents, and I said to the pastor, would you like me to ride your motorcycle to your home? And he said, no, pastor, I can do it. What he did not tell me that he had never ridden a motorcycle in his life. But this is how he reasoned. I can ride a bicycle. Surely a motorcycle is not much difficult. He think balancing was the main problem. But since he could do a bicycle, what's a motorcycle? However, he did not know how to start it. And he did not want to admit it to me. So he said, Pastor, I will give you the privilege to start my motorcycle. I'll tell you, the flash, And in those days, there was no button. You had to kickstart it. So I did, and he'd been watching me. And so he sat on the motorcycle, he pulled in the clutch, and he had the throttle wide open. The engine was screaming. And I tried to stop him, but he just let go the clutch. And the motorcycle did what young people love to do. He went way up in the air. I saw fear in his eyes, and there was a lamppost in front, and he hit it and damaged his brand new, it is for him, brand new motorcycle. And he fell. He wasn't hurt, he was just shocked. So I picked him up and I said, why didn't you tell me? He did not know how to ride a motorcycle. He said, Pastor, I thought I could do it. And the Jews thought they could keep the law. All that you say, we will what? Do. And they were worshipping a golden calf just a few days later. So God gave the law not to solve the sin problem. Yes, God does use the law for Christians as a standard of Christian living, but never to save us. We are saved by grace alone, through Christ alone, by faith alone. That's the foundation that the Reformation laid. We must build our Christianity on that foundation. So in verse 20, therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh, no human being will be justified in his sight, not our sight, his sight. For by the law is what? Knowledge of what? Look at the word sin, singular or plural. In most cases, when the word sin is in singular, it's the noun. So the law was given to show what we are at our very core. So when you first became a Christian, you made all kinds of promises. Did you keep them? Every new year, you make new resolutions. Do you keep them? That's the problem. The problem is not your resolution. The problem is at the very foundation. So let's see what the NIV has to say in these verses. Chapter 3 of Romans, and I'm reading verse 9. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin, singular, the noun. as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. The last part of verse 12. There is no one who does good, not even one. Verse 19, now we know. And I hope, folks, you know it by now. I've jumped some verses for the simple reason we don't have time, but read the whole passage. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. That's what God placed mankind under the law when he gave the law in Moses. So that every mouth, how many mouths? Every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world held accountability to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin, singular. So folks, I hope you realize that even though what I presented today was not good news, it was essential news. As long as you think there is some goodness in you, you will try to add to the righteousness of Christ. And many, many Adventists have been raised up with this idea. I must do my best and Christ will make up the rest. You won't find that in Scripture. That's a lie of the devil. Your best will never be good enough, because all our righteousness is like filthy rags. And in Zechariah, filthy rags is equated with iniquity, one of the words for sin. And iniquity means bent towards self. So everything we do in our own strength is motivated by a selfish nature. So my dear people, don't you ever trust in your flesh. And I will end up with this statement found in Jude. I think it's verse 23. When we really, truly understand our sinful nature, do you know what Jude says? I think it's verse, not 23, verse 13, I think. It says, we shall hate even the clothes. Let me read from the NIV. I know what the King James says, but I would like to say, Jude is a little book just before Revelation. No, sorry, it's not verse 13, it's verse 20. Okay, verse 23, the last part of verse 23. Hating even the clothing stained by a corrupted flesh. We will hate even the clothing that covers our corrupted flesh. So Paul can say in Romans 7:18, in me, that is in my human nature, nothing good dwells, nothing good. Yes, I may hate evil, I may want to do good, I may even choose the right thing, I may even delight in the law of God. But how to perform those things, I find not. Why? Because there is a nature that's pulling me down all the time. So I hope you realize that your only hope is not I, but who? Christ. And Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will what? Free. Because Jesus came primarily to save us from this sin nature problem. Because there is no human solution. Marxism, communism has tried and has failed. All religions have tried and they are failing miserably. So does Christianity. Any Christian who tries to improve his behavior by his own strength is fighting a losing battle. Yeah, he may deceive himself, like that young man said to me. I have not sinned for the last 2 years. And his wife, who looked miserable next to him, I said to her, it must be wonderful for you to live with a husband who stopped sinning. I said, my wife has a hard time with me. And she smiled. She would not answer because she was afraid to tell the truth. So I had to give him a text. Anyone who claims he has no sin is a what? Liar. The truth isn't abide. So if you're struggling, if you're failing, it is not because you are not sincere. Peter was very sincere when he said, others may deny you, but I will never deny you. I will die for you. Did he mean it? Yes. Was he successful? No. So my dear people, tomorrow morning is the good news. Chapter 3, verse 21 to 31. Just one section of chapter 3 of Romans. Please read it as often as you can from different translation. Chapter 3, 21 to 31 is our study tomorrow morning, the incredible good news of the gospel. And it is my prayer that you will rejoice in this truth. Okay, David, it's all yours. Yeah, okay.
Stay there. Thank you, Pastor Jack. That was a blessing. The universal sin problem.
Yeah.
For tomorrow, as you kind of make your way home this evening on the tube or a bus, or even walking, might be a bit more difficult walking, but read the rest of chapter 3 there of Romans, and also chapter 4 as well. Pastor Jack in the afternoon will be talking about chapter 4.
All of chapter 4.
That's right. So in the morning in our worship service beginning at 10:30, the title of your talk is Incredible Good News.
Yes.
And then chapter 4 you're talking about the enemy of the gospel.
That's right.
There in chapter 4. And of course, Jean will be also sharing both in the morning and the afternoon
Yes.
some of the experiences of meeting other Adventists around the world.
Okay.
Yeah. Pastor Jack, it's incredible to think that we're able to plug into the source of goodness just by bowing our heads in prayer. Okay. It's incredible to think that. And, Jesus says where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there will be amongst them. There must be something powerful about plugging in through prayer
right.
in community. And so starting this evening and all of this week, Jean, your wife, as well as some other people, Adriana this evening and Wendy. Where is Wendy? Wendy's down the back there. Jean and Adriana and Wendy. I can think of nobody better to be praying for you. And so what Jean and Adriana and Wendy tonight are going to do is they're going to just be over here in this corner. And if you have been touched by anything that Jack has said this evening, or if you have felt God speaking to you this week, or if there's something on your heart, maybe something either in your home, something with your family abroad, perhaps there's an illness in the family, then Jean and Wendy and Adriana would like to pray with you. So over the next 20 minutes, as we begin to conclude, 25 minutes, they'll be sitting over there, and you might like to quietly make your way there and pray with those folk regarding whatever's on your heart, whatever the Lord has placed on your heart. We'll be doing that tomorrow. We'll be doing that for the rest of the week leading up to next Sabbath, next Saturday.
That's right.
That'll be a blessing. Pastor Jack, you have chosen this song
Yes.
as the theme song that we'll be concluding each evening with. My hope is built on nothing less. Is there a reason why you've chosen that song as our theme song that we'll sing in a moment together?
Because it's presenting a truth that we need to remind ourselves. We can put no trust in our nature. Only in Jesus Christ.
My hope is built on nothing less. Most of you should have received this as you came in, or if you haven't, then I don't know, maybe just borrow one from someone. Maybe Svetla can hand it a couple of these. This is our concluding song. Mark is here, and he's going to play this for us. Play this as we sing. My hope is built on nothing less. I think it's plugged in and ready to go with. Do Young, I think, has plugged that in. Yeah, it's ready to go. I think. Yep. Just. It's not. Okay. And we might need to do it sans music. We might need to do it without music. Jack, are you okay with that?
I'm not a singer, but I will make it. Look, my wife is shaking her head.
No, she's not a singer.
No, I'm not a singer. She knows it.
Neither am I, Jack. So we're in trouble here. Felicia, can I just call upon you, rather spontaneously? Can you just come forward now?
And
Felicia is a far better singer than me, and maybe she's a better singer than you, Jack. And maybe Felicia, you're able to lead us through this. My hope is built on nothing less. No, that's okay. We'll do it without music tonight. That's all good. That's all good. And Pastor Jack, if you can just stay here when Felicia stops singing, maybe you can conclude with prayer.
Let's see, it's hard to do it without the piano. Okay. Yes, why don't we stand and let's all sing to the glory of the Lord. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus.
Jesus' name.